Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue with our little series on the esoteric and Gnostic relevance of myths, of mythology, and in so doing, I will refer at this point back to last week's consideration, which was on the great mythological figure of King Arthur, the once and future king. And in that respect, just very briefly, I add once again that to show the relationship, the topical relationship with Gnosis and with the Gnostic tradition, that C.G. Jung wrote at a certain point, fairly early in his career too, that the Gnostics were the only people who recognized the reality of and the reality in the psyche, that they realized that the individual human psyche, the individual human soul, mind even if you want to call it, is the place where the illuminating, the transcendentally oriented myths really reside. And that is really a very important matter, because we live in an extroverted civilization where we still sort of hold the prejudice that for something to be real, it has to be physical. Yeah? And it's a mistake. Actually, the physical world and the various physical things in it are less real than the realities of the psyche and the realities of the spirit. Why? Because they don't last, including our physical bodies themselves. I mean, you know, we all go. I have a book plate that was given to me, in fact, by a lady from England, and it has a picture on it of a skeleton with a mitre on his head. That's why she gave it to me. But there is also a Latin form of a verse from the Old Testament in it, which in English reads, "We shall all die, and like the water we shall go under the ground," which is quite a nice little image, I think. But the reason being that, let's say, it is understood that physical realities, and that the physical reality is evanescent and changing all the time. While look at, I mean, if you look it up in an encyclopedia, by the way, if you want one with the 20th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica is in the office there. In any event, you know, it will tell you that the Arthurian cycle of myths has been there for an incredibly long time. And so when he's called the once and future king, in the very title there is a timelessness that is indicated. So when we were speaking of that, I sort of let the mythological cat out of the bag by indicating that the figure of Arthur is not a historical figure, although perhaps the name of a historical person came to be attached to it at some time, but that's really of little import, but that what we are dealing there with is are real archetypal figures that live inside of us, in our psyche, as it is called by psychology, in the soul. And as such, I'll just throw that in now in order to move on to tonight's topic, that the people became aware at various times in history that they themselves may have been exposed to and may have had dealings with a once and future king, and meaning that there was a spiritually royal figure in their own experience, in the experience of their own psyche, which then at some time seemed to have gone away. But they expect it to come back. That is why it is once and future, rex quondam futurus in Latin. So the figure of Arthur is a good example, but practically any other mythological figure would be worthy of the same kind of treatment, that these are figures, beings, presences that have been experienced. And then quite often, after a while, the experience wasn't there anymore. And that therefore they are once and future. So this is, of course, very much in conformity with what the sort of the 20th century school of mythology. And these things always change at the university level, but that's not what we are interested in. Namely that there came a whole number of mythological scholars, Mircea Eliade, Heinrich Zimmer, Joseph Campbell, and my countryman Carl Kerini, whom by happenstance, who was a friend of my family, so I had seen him. We refer to all older persons of respect as aunt and uncle, so that was Uncle Carl. And Uncle Carl had the dinner at our house not long before he left Hungary during the war, never to return, but he became a close associate of Carl Jung in Switzerland. It was a time when smart people left the country. We were not smart ourselves, and therefore we stayed there and we suffered. But in other words, what could be called the 20th century school of mythology had accepted the in part psychological interpretation, in the sense that the mythological figures and their stories were a matter of interior experience of the individual, and that then they have been written up in story form. And as if they were very long lived, well then as I wrote in as a chapter heading, I think, in one of my books, the myth goes on, because it's there, but the story goes on, and then there are various subsidiary stories added to it and so forth. But the reality of the myth is that it is real inside of ourselves, and we have to take that into account. And it's to that proposition, to a considerable extent, that my little talk this evening is dedicated. So the reality is the experience of, or maybe I don't even express this right, but let's say the origin of the myth is a real experience of people within themselves. Then as time goes on, it becomes manifest in various literary expressions. Before there was any literature, then by the storytellers who come around and clear back into ancient Greece, carrying their lyre, the lyra, and while drumming on the lyra, tell the story of the gods and of the goddesses, the great myths. But the myth to be a truly effective and enduring myth has to occur within the individual. But that, of course, requires a sort of orientation that recognizes the inner world, the world of the psyche, the world of the soul, as something very real and very important, and not just some kind of a secondary flim-flam pseudo-reality. So we need to keep that in mind. So I think we got a little glimpse on the example of King Arthur, of the fact that a lot of these myths are once and future. They are experienced, and then often time goes on, various other experiences are had, and they sort of pale. But inasmuch as they had been experienced, they are still important, and they come back. They can come back into the life of the individual, they can come back into the life of peoples. And this is, I think, of extremely great importance, because even though our extroverted secular culture denies that to a considerable extent, what is experienced and what is known within us, that is important, that endures. That is something upon which the person and maybe other persons subsequently can draw. That which only occurs outside is, you might say, the very word history can be played with, and I have sometimes in my classes and so said, the question is this going to be his story or our story? So we need to remember that there is a perennial and a recurring importance of the truly great mythological figures, primarily because they are very intimately related to ourselves and because they have appeared to us in some experience and perhaps will do so again. Now, let me see. Professor Gilles Quispel, the great Gnostic scholar, in a sort of encyclopedic essay of his, had written that the Gnosis is personal experience which is turned into myth. And I think coming from one of the greatest scholars of that subject, and somebody whom we knew and who met with us and spoke for us when he was here, this is an important issue to remember. So Gnosis, as it is mentioned, say, in the Gnostic scriptures, which is just a Greek word for knowing, for knowledge, a certain kind of knowledge. It is a transcendentally inspired and transfused knowledge, that such knowledge is a personal experience of people, which then is turned into a myth. Now, I thought somewhat arrogantly, which is my wont, that I will employ a little method here tonight that I very seldom have employed before, and that is that I will start off this particular part of our discussion on a very personal note. And I looked and said, all right, what can I tell people that I have experienced and what turned into a myth in my life? And that might indicate to you how this sort of thing works on a personal level. And so I am going to do that now. The two examples of personal experience which I'll start out with are ones which I have mentioned in a public setting. This is only the second time in my life. So you are here, you are receiving a disclosure of very mysterious subjects. And they both go back, the experience, shall we say, goes back to my childhood. And one of these, well, I'll turn them around a little bit, yeah, because this experience, let's say, probably began when I was a little child. My parents and some other people would read to me from books. And that's maybe why I became quite fond of books for the rest of my life. And there was one individual story in a book. It was in German because we were bilingual at home. And its title was Vineta, the City Under the Water. And it is a mysterious story, presumably gathered originally by the people on the North Sea, the fishermen on the North Sea and around there, who have a myth that there is a sunken city underneath the ocean in that area, and that when they are out on a particularly clear day, they can often even see the buildings way down under the water, and when the water moves back and forth, they can hear the bells under the water. This story, particularly of the bells under the water, really grabbed my psyche. And I think that some of the later experiences that I had, which then sort of turned into one of my personal myths, had a great deal to do with that. Because I'm not doing this in chronological order. Let's see, I was going to tell two of my own experiences, and I'll take the one that occurred later. I moved that ahead now. I will tell you that one first. When I was, let's see, how old was I? I was probably about 4 years old when I began to have a curious waking vision experience every night before going to sleep. So it wasn't a dream yet. But so here I was in my bed, surrounded by my pet monkeys and one teddy bear, only one teddy bear. But in any event, and we living out in the countryside in northern Hungary, we had no electricity. So we had kerosene lamps and candles that we used. And so the lamp was on. When I went into this visionary state. And it always started every night for years. It started the same way. I found myself standing or sitting, I'm not really sure which one, on a seashore with a beautiful blue ocean and a sort of a blue Mediterranean sky Now you need to remember, I had never seen an ocean by that time because I lived in a landlocked country. We had a seaport at one time, but after World War I it was taken away from us and given to Italy, of all people, who already had a whole bunch of seaports. That's how politics works, it's a mess. But in any event, even though I had never seen an ocean, it was an idyllic scene, and I was looking out over a golden sort of railing that separated the earth from the ocean, and looking out at this idyllic scene. But as I stood there watching, the scene changed, and a big dark cloud arose, and a huge storm seemed to arise on the ocean, which brought the waves of the ocean over, and they spilled over the land and over myself. So there was something like, on a Japanese example, they call it tsunami nowadays, that sort of thing, wherein the ocean came and covered the land. And then I found myself under the water. Now, as I say, I was never very, I hardly, I never learned to swim. I was asked sometimes on a significant occasion, what would you do if you fell into the ocean? So I said, well, I'd probably drown. And I still have that answer. But in any event, in the vision, I now found myself under the water. And it was filled with the most astonishingly strange creatures. Not just octopuses and fish and things like that, which I had some knowledge of from books, but weird looking things, resembling dragons, all kinds of things, but none of them were apparently hostile. And so I lay there in bed, watching these strange creatures swim back and forth. Most of them were luminous, so that they were shining in the semi-darkness, and they were extremely interesting to me. So my mother said subsequently that I was lying there in bed with my eyes wide open, in great amazement, and I kept watching something that was not available to other people. So then I told my parents and said, look at these beautiful creatures in all kinds of colors, and this one has 5 heads, whatever it is, very mythological and very strange creatures that were all swimming by. They never bothered me. They never threatened to eat me or anything like that. But they provided an ongoing and, to me, exceedingly interesting entertainment. You have to remember, of course, that my early childhood occurred way before the era of television. We barely had one radio in the house, and the radio does not produce visions and so forth, but I would be there, bug-eyed, lying in bed, watching the scenery. And so, my parents were very tolerant people, at least of me. They may not have been tolerant of other people sometimes. But and so my parents apparently decided that it was a good idea that I saw all of these things. And about the only thing that I ever overheard say, well, the boy has a really vivid, really good imagination, and that's it. And it went on and on and on. So after several hours, then eventually it was discovered that if there was not dark in the room, but some light in the room, then the imagery that I saw was was much more faint. It was still there, but in the dark it was in extremely vivid colors and so forth. And this went on, believe it or not, it would seem to me pretty much every night for about between 3 and 4 years. Every night, instead of going to sleep or at the beginning of going to sleep, I would see these curious scenes. But it also always started with the vision of the idyllic blue ocean and the blue sky, and then the great tidal wave coming and covering everything up, and then being underneath the ocean. That's sort of a little after, probably between 7 and 8 years of age, it faded and it did not occur anymore. All right. So let's say there was a pretty intense and pretty lasting experience. And I might as well attach to it how, as the years went by, and as I was growing up, and by that time probably after about the year 1944, winter of 1944, when we were in the war and all kinds of most unpleasant experiences occurred, I slowly came to the recognition, not right away, that what I saw in these visions was the destruction and the covering up of the reality of what had been my life up to that time, and the arising of a new and strange reality. And I often recall that interpretation, and I still adhere to it, because at a certain point in my life, when I was going on 13, everything in our country, in my society changed and became a weird world that actually in the physical reality was much more terrifying than in the visionary state. So I came to interpret this as an experience which gave rise to a myth of the, let's say, of the tsunami of the soul, that there are times in our lives when our reality within which we lived up to a certain point is wiped out, and another reality, sometimes a very strange one, sometimes a very scary one, but not always, still interesting, arises. And I would say that this particular circumstance definitely constituted thereafter a myth, maybe not the myth, but a myth of my life. How an entire countryside, how an entire reality can be wiped out by something that is coming and changed into a completely different reality, which, if you treat it that way, may become quite frightening, but if you just take it as it comes, it actually may even be somewhat interesting. So this is one. An experience, prolonged experience, which is turned by the person into a myth, in this case a personal myth. Now, the other experience, which occurred actually chronologically a little bit earlier, because I was badgering my mother almost clear to the time of her death, to try to tell me how old was I when I had this experience. And finally she said that she was quite certain and that she comparing it with various other experiences, that I was 3 years old. So there would be about 1 year before the other sequence of experiences. But this experience was a single experience, and it was a dream. So here is the dream. I am led into a big room, sort of Victorian living room, somewhat similar to the one that we occupied. And there are big, heavy drapes on the walls and in front of the windows. And somebody is with me, but I only see the hands. So they were the hands of a man, very nice, clean, well-kept hands, with maybe 1 or 2 rings on them, but the rings were not prominent. The hands came and pulled this heavy drapery, the heavy curtain aside. And what revealed itself in the back of the curtain was something that is difficult to describe, because it seems to be a combination of painting and of a living image. So maybe what the French call a tableau vivant, the living picture. And this was the living, like a great big frame, and you look out on the frame, and there is the picture, but the picture was alive. And it depicted, again, a stormy ocean with waves, with foam, white foam on them, and so, but not very high, just a wavy ocean, storm above with rain coming down, as well as lightning flashes. And in this curious scene stood a gigantic and somewhat terrifying figure. It was the figure of what I probably would have imagined at the time or later on as a little child, a figure of a devil. It had horns, hair on him, and he stood in the water, sort of above his ankles, almost between his ankles and his knees. He stood in the stormy water, and he held in his hands, I almost said in his claws, because the claws were embedded in the subject. He held the globe, or a globe. Now, I knew what a globe was because we had one in the house. The people, that's the way people studied geography with the globes. So he held the globe in his claws, embedded in the globe itself, out of which some drops, I couldn't tell whether they were drops of blood or drops of water. And I even said, I think after that, when I told my parents, I had an impression that they were, or at least that some of them were drops of tears. And these drops were dropping and running down into the water in which the demonic figure stood, with a very unpleasant and triumphant expression on his face. Well, all right, so there was a dream. But I was already, although I was a tiny little kid, I was already in the habit of telling my dreams. Almost every morning when he was home, my father was in the living room, which my bedroom's door opened into the dining room. And he sat there drinking his tea and smoking his Albanian and Turkish cigarettes. In any event, and the first thing he said to me when I came out and I said, "Good morning, Father," he said, "All right, son, what did you dream?" So, I was a lucky fellow that I had parents like that who were so interested and so accepting of these things. So, obviously, I was subject to a similar inquiry that morning, which was a Sunday morning, and then I told my father and my mother of the dream, because I was pretty agitated by it. It was not a pleasant picture. It wasn't that demonic figure would come out of the picture, but it just that it depicted something very unpleasant. So there we were, Sunday morning. We had a chapel in our garden where we went to Mass, and on Sunday after the service, we usually, the celebrant priest who had come from another village to say Mass had his brunch with us. And so my father, who was a bold man quite often, he said, "All right, son, why don't you tell the father about your dream?" And I said, "All right." So I told as much as I could. And the priest, curiously enough, was rather impressed. And he said something, well, I think, if I remember correctly, he said, the Holy Spirit sometimes reveals to little children what we adults cannot handle. And he says that certainly the world is in a very bad shape because Hitler was already carrying on and everything. And then this may have, the devil, as he called it, is holding the world in his claws. So this may be a depiction of the way that the world is at that time. So we all thanked him, and however, this dream had very important consequences in my life. Unlike the visions of the strange creatures under the water, and the great consequence was that it seems to me, in retrospect, that fairly soon thereafter, but it couldn't have been that earlier, I learned somehow that there were some people at an earlier time in the world who had the teaching that the world was to a major extent and much of the time under the dominion of an evil power, and that these people were called Gnostics. And from that moment on, I was probably 5 or 6 by then when that information came to me. From that moment on, I was on the trail of the Gnostics. We had a great many books in our residence, but we went around visiting, and anywhere I went, encyclopedias, picture books, history books, I was looking for Gnostics. And if you look with that amount of zeal, and for years, as you're growing up, you know what, you're going to find something. And I did. And then, one after the other, various sources of information, primarily books, came into my vision, which dealt with the Gnostics. One of them, a few years later, but still I think I couldn't have been more than 10 years old by then, or 8 or something like that, was a book that, just because of this, really played a very, very important role in my life. And it was a book by a 19th century Russian historical novelist by the name of Dmitry Merezhkovsky. Most people haven't heard of him, but if you look very, very hard, you'll find it. And Merezhkovsky wrote a trilogy, of which the first volume was Julian and the Death of the Gods. That's the English title. And it had to do with Julian, the Emperor Julian the Apostate, the nephew of Constantine the Great, and his carryings on. And then, just to mention it, because those are much more popular books, the second volume was the Romance of Leonardo da Vinci. And the third one was Peter and the Third Rome. And this was about Peter the Great and Russia. They are all translated. And they are okay historical novels, nothing that wild about them. But what got me was that in the book on Julian and the Death of the Gods, there is a scene which I think did actually occur in history. When Julian, Julian was the nephew of the emperor who made the Byzantine Empire Christian. But Julian didn't like the Christians. And so when he became emperor, which he did, he called together a huge council where all the various Christian groups, all the different heresies and all the different monks and everybody else were all invited. And there were no illustrations in the book, but in my mind's eye, even now, I can see Julian is on a sort of balcony, looking down into the hall where all the people are gathering, looking down at them. Since he didn't like the Christians with considerable contempt, or look at all those stupid people, they could be worshipping Zeus and Aphrodite and things like that. Instead of that, they worship what he called in one of his speeches the pale Galilean. Jesus. How he knew that Jesus was pale, I don't know. But a Byzantine emperor knows everything. So there he was, but there was one scene in the story wherein people are coming into the hall for this meeting, and in walks a group of people. I think they all wore long white robes. That's how it's described in the book. And in front of them, the man who is out in front of the group is carrying a cross. And on the cross is the figure of a serpent, the serpentine cross, which, of course, if you know a little bit of Bible, you'll know that is also the brazen serpent of Moses in the Exodus myth, which he is inspired to make, and which becomes a healing agent for the people who are bitten by the 7 plagues of Egypt. One of them is venomous serpents. So it's not an unknown symbol, but and somehow that image of this group of people coming in and the one in front carrying the serpentine cross absolutely floored me. I couldn't think of anything else for days. I can't tell you why. I mean, I probably knew the biblical story about Moses already, but other than that, I had no acquaintance with that sort of thing at all. But it really grabbed me. And I said, Then I learned these people who were coming in under the auspices of the serpentine cross were a group of Gnostics. That Merezhkovsky wrote it like. So I said, now I really have to find the Gnostics. So my zeal in searching them out has increased 1,000-fold. And once again, if you keep that up, eventually you'll find something. And of course, I mean, anywhere we went visiting, you know, out in the country, people read a lot of books. So people had big libraries. So the first thing I would go to some history books, encyclopedias, look under the G, Gnostics, you know, and they kept this up and they kept this up. And obviously I amassed a certain amount of information as well as probably misinformation. But then as time went on, well, now the great changes occurred, 1944, 1945. I was enrolled at the Cistercian monastic school in Budapest, and we had our professor of theology was a very, very learned man. He was teaching in Rome prior to that, Professor Zemplin. He organized a religious history club among us. I was about 14 by then. And so we would get together outside of class, and then at every time one of us little fellows had to present a paper about something that pertained to religious history, to theology, things like that. And so there we were, and we had a textbook, and in that textbook there was a chapter on the Gnostics. Very small chapter, and needless to say, they were not treated in a very kindly fashion. But there it was, and then under the chapter did not contain anything that I hadn't picked up already in my Gnostic hunt. But there was a sizable footnote, and I'll never forget it. And it says something, I'm translating it now from the Hungarian. This, the most pernicious of all the heresies, has happily ceased to exist, but its teachings continue in the strange teachings of something that is called theosophy. So here I was, the 14-year-old student in the little seminary. Well, okay, if I can't find any real Gnostics, I mean Gnostics who call themselves that, I have to find this theosophy. So just as soon as I was able, which was within the next couple of years, and I availed myself of further information. I even met some people in Belgium, by then I was 16 years old, who considered themselves practicing Gnostics. They were Belgian Martinists, students of the late Papius and so forth, and they showed me books on contemporary Gnosticism, ancient Gnosticism, things of that sort, and that's where I really got a lot of information. So there we were, and now here we are, and because this is where those readings led me to, and. Since then, I was on the search for the Gnostics, and I certainly also found a great deal of sympathy and a great deal of information, although not in exact detail often among the theosophists. And that was really the beginning of my Gnostic career. I never let go of it. I was like, in fact, I think somebody said so, one of my friends said so, that I was like a dog with his bone. I wouldn't let go of the Gnostics, no matter what. I had to find out everything that I could. I had to meet everybody whom I could, and right up to the present time. So, all right. What was this? Dream. the dream turned into a myth. The myth was that I need to find the Gnostics and that I need to become, if possible, I need to become one myself. And it was the beginning of the myth of my life. If it hadn't been for that, my life would have gone in a very, very different direction. So these are the two, there are others, but these are the two experiences, the experiences that occurred in childhood and which became very, very important elements of my life, and without them my life would have proceeded in an entirely different fashion. Now, maybe it's a little bit highfalutin to pass this off as an example of how myths develop, but here there are experience which in the psyche is processed and worked on and is developed into a myth, and then it goes from there. So it's a good little example, and it's the example that I know about because it happened to me. I don't know anybody else's. However, let us say, then of course as time went on, even though we only had little reverberations of it, I was still studying by that time in Austria. We received sort of rumors that a big bunch of ancient books had been discovered right at the end of the war, about 1946, in Egypt, near a hamlet called Naj Hammadi, and that these were Gnostic books. And I was still in the Catholic Church. I went to a Catholic school, all of that, and I knew some very, very knowledgeable and very influential professors, including one whom in my Gnostic Jung book, in the introduction, I call Professor J, because I promised him. It was a Hungarian university professor who was formerly a Jesuit, although by this time he was not a Jesuit, but he was still a priest, who became really very important in my life. He was a very, very wise man, and he advised me even on this Gnostic situation. But let us say I discussed my by then really overwhelming interest in the Gnostics with him. And he was, he was a very tolerant, a very wise man. He said, "Look, son, there are a lot of good things that happened throughout the history of the Church that have been discarded, that have not endured. And the Gnostics were one of them, and he knew quite a bit. He said they are actually a very interesting school of thought." And he told me, now if you are going to continue with your furious interest in this subject, you are going to have to be careful, because other priests that you may be talking about are not going to be as nice about it as I am. But if you want to, go ahead and do it. He said, and he even told me that I could remain in the Roman Catholic Church, and I could study for the priesthood as long as I kept my Gnostic interests a little bit undercover, But I told him, I said, "Professor, I can't do that. It's just too powerful. My desire is too powerful." Well, he said, "If that's what you are called to do, you will have to go and do what you can on your own." And I did what I could on my own, and I'm here. Yeah. God bless him, a great and wonderful gentleman. In any event, so I continued, and the rest of it, let's put it, the rest of it is not history, but my story. But this is the way these things work. You experience something that really grabs you, and then that experience will not rest. It wants to be used, it wants to be pursued. You got to be there do something with me, do something with me. And so much so that if you don't, you don't feel good. You receive an interior punishment for not doing what something very powerful inside of you wants you to do. And that is how the myths of the world, the myths of the various religions came into existence. And within the Western Christianity, well, both Western and Eastern Christianity, I don't have to apologize because our Greek friend isn't here tonight. I have to be nice to the Orthodox as long as he comes here. But this is the way in which this process works. And really what happens, what would have happened to me, I'm convinced that if I had somehow stifled this desire, I would have had bad experiences. It would have been very bad for me. And while it has deprived me of some, it deprived me of a clerical career in the Roman Catholic Church. It deprived me of various things, but I